I have been thinking about, praying about, wrestling with, studying for this series for a really long time, probably one of the longest series. And so what I'm going to try to do is try to keep my sermons to like 35 to 40 minutes, because I've got about 2 hours worth of material every Sunday that I want you to have. So if it goes over and you've got a roast in the oven and you need to leave, please know that I love you and that there's no judgment. But we are starting this brand new series today based on the book of Ecclesiastes. And something happened in my heart about, I think it was probably closer to 6 months ago. And I was just wrestling through some stuff. And I was struggling. And what came to my heart, what came to my mind were some of the passages that are in Ecclesiastes. And it's not like your traditional book, right? It's not kind of like one that everybody knows an awful lot about. So I just started wrestling and started reading and started praying through it. And God's been doing all this really cool stuff in my heart and in my mind over the last probably 6 months. And my hope and prayer is that it will kind of usher all of us as a church into a new understanding of God's word and new ways to live in accordance with Jesus. So even though, just so you understand, the book of Ecclesiastes doesn't actually reference Jesus. So some people, especially some pastors, have a tendency to avoid Ecclesiastes. It's a more difficult book to preach through. But will you kind of lean in with me these next 12 weeks? Will you wrestle through the good, the bad, and the frustrating that is Ecclesiastes? And I was having a conversation. With a young man who goes to our church. I won't use his name. And he asked me a question about 2 weeks ago. And it number one, it struck me. But number two, it really kind of began to resonate in my heart for this series. And so I'm going to ask you this question. Same question that was asked of me. Here it is. What if we had the opportunity to know the date and time that our own life would end? What would change? What would change about our behaviors? What would change about our decision making? What would change about our time? Like if we could circle a date on a calendar and we knew that that would be the day, that would be the time that we would take our last breath, that our heart would beat for the last time. Now, I understand it's a bit of a morbid question. I also understand that it's an impossibility for most of us, really all of us. But what Ecclesiastes does for us, Ecclesiastes challenges us to start with the end in mind, to take the one inevitable part of life, that being death, and then work our way backwards. So what if, right? What if you had the opportunity to know the day and time that your life would end? How would it affect your decisions? How would it affect your time? How would it affect your money? How would it affect the things that you get anxious about or fearful about? How would it affect your conversations with your spouse, potentially? How would it affect those core relationships? You see, the book of Ecclesiastes challenges us to live life backward. To live life backward. To start with our own inevitability of death. And then kind of reverse engineer the way that we choose to live. This title, actually, for today's sermon comes directly from a book by a man named David Gibson, and it's called Living Life Backward. And he takes all of Ecclesiastes and really challenges us to look at life differently. We spend so much time thinking about what it means to live that we spend very little time preparing to die. But it's only in preparing to die that we can really choose to live. This is what Ecclesiastes is trying to tell us. And so I want to start with this quote from David that I just felt was really powerful for us. Ecclesiastes encourages us to take the one thing in the future that is certain, our death, and work backward from that point into all of the details, decisions, and heartaches of our lives, and to think about them from the perspective of the end. And then he goes on to say, it is the destination that makes sense of the journey. It is the destination that makes sense of the journey. So many of us in this post-COVID era, right, in this life of uncertainty, we begin to ask the question, what matters in life? Where does meaning come from? Where does purpose come from? Where does value come from? As we approach in the United States the marker that is 1 million Americans who've lost their lives in some way, shape, or related to COVID, we're asking these kinds of questions. Like what in all of life really matters? And Ecclesiastes challenges us to do the thing that we don't want to do, to think about our own death, to think about the day in which we would no longer exist on this earth, and then look at everything from that lens, our relationships, our decision-making. And that's what we're going to do for these next 12 weeks. Rather than this being kind of a morbid discussion, right? Rather than this being kind of a dark discussion, I would say that really what Ecclesiastes does, it challenges us to live our life backward. And it doesn't just talk about death. Yes, there are 22 different references depending on your translation, but in 12 chapters there are 22 references to death or dying. But then there's another 51 references to life and hope. And so what Ecclesiastes does, it takes the complexities and contrasts of life and he kind of balances them out together. And so what I'm going to ask you to do as we read through Ecclesiastes Chapter 1, would you watch for some of those kind of, I'll call them the pairings of contrasting and comparing life and death, good and bad, wisdom and foolishness, okay? Because the writer of Ecclesiastes is kind of taking us through not just the morbidity of death, but the beauty of life. And it's incredibly well balanced through Ecclesiastes. I read a study recently that said that Johns Hopkins University did this survey of, I want to read it to you, just about 8,000 college students at 48 different colleges, and they asked the question, what is the biggest reason you've come to college? What's the reason that you chose college? 78% of those 8,000 college students at 48 different campuses said that their first goal at college was to figure out the meaning and purpose of life. The meaning and purpose of life. We're in a bit of a crisis right now as a society, just trying to figure out why does things happen, especially bad things, and what is the meaning, what is the purpose of life? Ecclesiastes challenges us to start with the end in mind. So we're going to start with Ecclesiastes Chapter 1. I'm going to read through the whole chapter together, and then we're going to go back and unpack it, okay? So reading from Ecclesiastes 1, these are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. Okay, thanks for coming. Have a good night. See you next week. It gets better, honest. Everything is meaningless, completely meaningless, says the teacher. Verse 3, what do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, and then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again, and the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description. Again, thank you for coming. You guys know all this information already. Everything is wearisome beyond description, says the teacher. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Sometimes people say, here is something new, but actually it is old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in the future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now. I, the teacher, was king of Israel, and I lived in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to search for understanding and to explore by wisdom everything being done under the heavens. I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. You ever feel that way? Let's be honest. I soon discovered that God has dealt dealt a tragic existence to the human race. Verse 14, I observed everything going on under the sun, and really, it's all meaningless, like chasing the wind. What is wrong cannot be made right. What is missing cannot be recovered. And I said to myself, look, I am wiser than any of the other kings who've ruled in Jerusalem before me. I have greater wisdom and knowledge than any of them. So I set out to learn everything from wisdom to madness and folly, but I learned firsthand that pursuing all of this is like chasing the wind. The greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. So let me give you some background on Ecclesiastes. I mentioned before that oftentimes pastors will avoid Ecclesiastes. I probably should have. We'll see how this goes for the next 12 weeks. But because when I start a new series, especially on a book of the Bible, there's kind of 8 different things that I look at as kind of a starting point. I'm going to walk you through those 8. And I'll say this, that there is a fair amount of ambiguity within theological cultures with regards to Ecclesiastes. So one of the first things we need to know is that Ecclesiastes is in the Old Testament, right? It's the 39 books, Genesis through Malachi. It's God's original word to the people of Israel. And so it's part of the Old Testament. We know that for sure. Second thing we need to know is that it's part of a section in the Bible called the wisdom literature. So this is like Proverbs and some parts of the Psalms and Song of Solomon, right? These are designed to kind of give us an understanding of how to live within the world that God has created, how to live properly within the world that God's created, right? That's what the wisdom literature does. And what wisdom literature does, it actually kind of, as I said before, it does like this really honest kind of balancing of good and bad, right and wrong, ugly and beautiful, right? And tries to bring out wisdom within the world that God's created. So those are the 2 things that we know for sure about Ecclesiastes. It's from the Old Testament. It's part of the wisdom literature section. Next thing, we don't actually know the author. For a long time, people thought it was Solomon because of the reference to being the son of the king of David. Problem is, as far back as Martin Luther, many of the theologians are like, nah, that can't be true. So there's a significant amount of debate as to who actually wrote Solomon, or maybe there was multiple authors, potentially, because of the first and third person and the writing of it. So I actually can't tell you who wrote the book of Solomon, other than that God inspired someone to do that. So what you'll hear me say often is the teacher, the teacher, the teacher. That's what I'll refer to. And when I'm talking about the teacher, I'm talking about the person that wrote. Could have been Solomon, but most of the evidence that has to do with regards to the actual whole book itself and the kind of setting, it really was much later than Solomon's life. So we don't really know the author. We don't even really know the readers. We know that it's probably written to the people of Israel, but we don't know what time frame. We don't know where they were living at the time. There's a lot of uncertainty with regards to the readers. So these are the first 4 things I look for when I'm getting ready to start a new series. The origin, the section, the author, the readers, and then I go into the time. So what's the time period? Well, there's, again, a fair amount of debate. You can see why I probably shouldn't have picked this book. There's a fair amount of debate as to when this book was even written. Many theologians more recently believe that it's probably one of the newest Old Testament books that we have, as recently as the 3rd century BC. So it might be the youngest Old Testament book in the entire Bible, just based on some of the context and some of the references. It could be 3rd century, which is even after Malachi, which is one of the last books of prophecy. So this is a relatively young book in terms of antiquities, if that makes any sense. Okay, so here's the time. It's debated. The purpose isn't super clear. So this is the other thing. Many theologians have different perspectives as to why the book was written. Some think it was about life. Some think it was about death. Some think it's about trying to understand God. Some think that the author was just kind of just showing off all the wisdom he's figured out, right? There's not a whole lot of clarity even as to the primary core purpose of the book of Ecclesiastes. It's going to be a fun couple of weeks. The structure is super varied, right? There's first person and third person. There's prose and there's poetry. There's allegory. There's all these kinds of different references to things that are both old and new. It's a very complex book, and even in terms of its structure. At one point, that you feel like the author is talking to himself. Like, it's a complex book. And then the question is, what are the themes? Well, honestly, there's a lot of different themes in the book of Ecclesiastes. God's referenced 39 times. Meaninglessness or vanity is referenced 38 times. Death is referenced 22 times. The goodness of God or goodness in general is listed 51 times, Fearing God is listed 9 times. So even the theme is a bit complex. But one thing I want you to recognize, that throughout the entire book of Ecclesiastes, there are 2 primary perspectives, okay? This is so important for you to get. There are 2 primary perspectives that are being brought out in the context of Ecclesiastes. The first is the horizontal relationships. When you hear under the sun or under the heavens, right? You heard that just in the reading I gave you. Under the sun, under the heavens, the author, the teacher, is talking about relationships with people that are, horizontal relationships here on earth. Humans. But then there's this other perspective that is happening, and that is the vertical relationship with God. So if you've ever seen the back of a tapestry, I know this is not something that we have a lot of in our modern day, but when you flip a tapestry around, you see lines running this way and you see lines running this way, right? And these horizontal and vertical lines, they kind of begin to form this beautiful picture, and you need to understand that this is Ecclesiastes, that there are 2 primary perspectives that are going on, and then the teacher kind of weaves them together horizontally and vertically to create this beautiful depiction of what it means to live life backwards, to start with the end in mind, both relationally, horizontally, and relationally, vertically with God himself, okay? So there's all the stuff that I don't know. These 2 things are probably the most clear, that it's the Old Testament, it's wisdom literature, and that also these perspectives on Ecclesiastes, that it's horizontal and vertical. You'll see it over and over and over again. But there is so much debate and uncertainty around a lot of the things of Ecclesiastes. And so what I'm going to share with you is my prayerful perspective on it, but I recognize that it may not be consistent with the way you've heard it preached before. And much like life, we're going to lean into the tension. All the debate and uncertainty around Ecclesiastes, it seems an awful lot like real life, doesn't it? And it's interesting to me that the person who's writing a book on how to live life backwards kind of reverse engineers his book so that we can't really understand it in a really easy way, right? It becomes complex. That's just kind of the way life is. So let's go back to Ecclesiastes 1, and let's take some time to look for both the vertical and horizontal relationships that are mentioned in Ecclesiastes 1, and then can we also watch for what it means to live life backwards, reverse engineering our life, starting with the end in mind, okay? So notice in Ecclesiastes 1:1, these are the words of the teacher, the king of David, son of David, who ruled in Jerusalem. So what we have here is what I said before, it's third person, right? Many theologians believe that this was added later, that really the start of Ecclesiastes is right here, this very encouraging statement. Everything is meaningless, as the teacher, completely meaningless. Most believe that this was added later as an attempt to kind of give some credibility to the book. That somebody added in like, hey, we got to figure out who this is from or what this is for. Solomon was smart. Let's put his name here, right, basically. So you could kind of read Solomon, but it was most likely added later. But when you get to verse 2, this is the teacher's thesis statement. You can imagine, if you have any experience in education, if you are a teacher yourself, it would start with a thesis statement. This is what the teacher believes most, right? This is his starting point. And he says, everything is meaningless, completely meaningless. Okay, so this word meaningless here is actually the most important word in the entire book of Ecclesiastes. And I want to give it to you in the Hebrew because we need to understand it's the word hevel. Many Bibles translate it either as meaningless or vanity, but the problem is there is no direct translation between hevel and the English language. We don't have anything in our language that fits. One of the closest things that I think fits to help us understand what hevel really is isn't necessarily meaninglessness or vanity, but actually vapor or breath or smoke. It's kind of how it's been used in different parts throughout the Old Testament. Really temporary, fleeting, hard to hold, right? You ever tried holding smoke in your hand? You know it's there, you can see it, you grab it for a moment, as soon as you open your hand, it's gone. You ever tried holding your breath in your hand in the middle of the wintertime, right? And the steam comes out, and you try to capture it, and you open it up, and it's gone. So just understand that the author isn't just saying that everything is meaningless, he's saying it's temporary, it's fleeting. It's really hard to hold on to. You ever found that to be true in life? That life can be temporary, fleeting, hard to hold on to. That's why this one word is so important. We don't have a direct translation in English, but hevel is what keeps coming up again and again when the teacher uses the word meaningless or vanity, okay? So let me just give you an example of hevel. Psalm 144, 3-4. O Lord, what are human beings that you should notice them, mere mortals that you should think about them, for they are like a breath of air. There's that word again, hevel. So in Psalm 144, it's actually described as a breath of air, like just a puff. Right? It's there, it's real, but you can't really hold on to it. You can't do anything about it. Their days are like a passing shadow. Proverbs 31 describes hevel this way. Charm is deceptive, beauty does not last. That's hevel, right? It's fleeting, it's temporary. So various places throughout the Old Testament, hevel is described as it's real, but it's really hard to hold on to. It's temporary, it's fleeting. This is so important for us to understand about the book of Ecclesiastes. This one word, hevel, will come up over and over and over again. And it is the teacher's way of trying to help us understand that life is temporary. Life is fleeting. That it's hard to hold on to. And the moment that you think you've got it figured out, it's gone. Ever feel that way with life? Just about the time you feel like you've got it all figured out, like you wake up one morning and go, what just happened? This is the author's thesis, the teacher's thesis, that everything is hevel. It's temporary, it's fleeting, it's hard to hold on to. Verse 3, so what do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Okay, so for the next, let's see how many verses. 4 verses, what the teacher does, he is like backing up his thesis statement. Maybe she is, sorry for the gender pronoun, but he or she is backing up, this teacher is backing up their statement that everything is meaningless, and he goes into the reasons why, right? He starts saying, like verse 3, what do people get for all their hard work under the sun, right? Verse 4, generations come, generations go, but the earth never changes. Verse 5, the sun rises and the sun sets and then hurries back and rises again. You see what the teacher's doing? The teacher is using observations of real life, the way that nature works, the repetitive nature of life, to help us understand that life is fleeting. It's hard to hold on to. That life is temporary. They reflect on the generations coming and going, the sun rising and setting and then coming back again. Verse 6, the winds blow south and turn north. Again, he's still observing just the way life works. Wind blows south and north again, around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. You ever thought about how that happens? How the rivers just keep running to the sea, and yet the rivers don't run out, and the sea doesn't overfill? Then water returns again to the rivers and flows out again. See, life has this rhythm to it that humans can do nothing about, nothing to change it. This is what the teacher is trying to help us understand. That life, the rising and setting of the sun, the generations coming and going, the way that the wind blows from one direction to the other and then back again, the way that the rivers run into the sea and yet never fill it up. Like what the author is trying to help us understand, what makes life so temporary, so fleeting, is that life has this rhythm to it that we can't stop, that we can't do anything about. And at like both times, it's both encouraging, right? The rhythm of life, and then it's like maddening at times. Oh, it's that time of year again? Oh, I got to go back there again, right? It's why we love spring, because spring is new, but spring is here again, right? It's new, but it's coming again. This is the observation of the teacher with regards to why life is temporary, why life is fleeting. Okay, so then he goes into verse 8. And at verse 8, he says that everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are never content. This is the first of two primary burdens of mankind. Verse 8, he talks about, in the first one, is that we as mankind were never satisfied. This is the problem. There's a rhythm to life. There's a rhythm to nature. There's a rising and a setting of the sun. But as humans, we are very rarely, if ever, satisfied. No matter how much we get, it's never enough. When was the last time you said to yourself, hey, I have enough money. I got plenty of time. I've got all the vacation I need. We don't. Because one of the greatest burdens that we carry as humans, the teacher is reminding us that mankind is just never satisfied. We never get enough. And so it leads to this kind of meaningless feeling. And all the while, the seasons come and go, generations come and go, the sun rises and sets, the water goes to the sea, and there's this repetitive nature that we can do nothing about, and yet we're never satisfied. This is the first burden that we have as humans. And then he goes into verse 9. History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Sometimes people say, here is something new, but actually it's old. Nothing is ever truly new. He's saying, like humans, we have this crazy curiosity with the new, where we just want more. We want to experience more. We want to have more. We want to know more. And all the while, mankind is struggling to find meaning. So, let me just give you one little bit, a piece of data with regards to our curiosity and desire for new. Did you know that every single day, our society, our world, creates 2.5 quintillion bytes of data electronically on social media? 2.5 quintillion. I don't even know how many zeros that is. But let me explain to you that 90% of the electronic data that is produced in the last 2 years didn't exist 3 years ago. So 90% of the data that we have over the last 2 years has been created in the last 2 years. And in the next 2 years, it's going to happen again. We are creating just tremendous amounts of electronic data, all because of our desire for new. There are 4 million posts per minute on Facebook every single day. 4 million. You ever think to yourself, I just want to catch up on Facebook? 4 million. Good luck. Per minute. Let's see how you do. 4 million posts per minute on Facebook. But let me ask this question. Is all of this content, is all of this new material, is it really new? And is it actually filling us? Is it fulfilling us? Or do we just feel more empty when we're done? This is what the teacher is trying to help us understand, that we as mankind, we're just never satisfied. We always seem to want new. And yet, God has this rhythm to the world that we can do nothing about. Verse 11, this is where we come up with the second burden of humanity, according to the teacher. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in the future generations, no one will remember what we're doing now. Okay, so the first burden was that mankind is never satisfied. The second burden is that mankind rarely finds any meaning. Right? I read a statistic recently that says 100 years from the day I die, no one will remember that I existed. For 99% of society, within 100 years of your death, not one person on earth will remember that you existed. And so we, as mankind, we struggle, we strive, we work hard, we try to acquire, we try to experience, we try to do, we try to be with, right? There's all these different ways that we are working so hard to find meaning and purpose in life, and yet just 100 years after our death, no one even knows that we lived. This is what the teacher is telling us, right? Generations come and generations go. Nothing really ever changes. And this is what is so hevel about life. This is what is so heavy, so fleeting, so temporary, so hard to hold, is that we're never satisfied and we rarely find meaning on this earth. And then he goes into verse 12 through 18, what the teacher does, begins to so we start with the thesis statement, everything is meaningless, everything is hevel, observations as to why, and then he talks about the ways that the teacher has pursued meaning, purpose, right? And he starts with the pursuit of knowledge. It makes sense. He's a teacher. We start with the brain. Verse 12, I, the teacher, was king over Israel. I lived in Jerusalem. I devoted myself to search for understanding and explore by wisdom everything being done under the heavens. And soon I discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race, right? So he's saying he's worked really hard. He's gone to all the schools. He's taken all the tests. He's got all the extra letters at the end of his name. And yet all he can figure out is that life is pretty meaningless. Fleeting, temporary, hevel, smoke, hard to hold. He starts with this pursuit of knowledge. And look what he says in verse 14. I observed everything going on under the sun, and really it is all meaningless, like a chasing of the wind. Really it is all hevel. And why? This is his reason. What is wrong cannot be made right. What is missing cannot be recovered. So do you understand what the teacher is trying to help us grasp? That is, no amount of knowledge will change the wrong things in the world. No amount of information will make the wrong things right. He's saying he's studied and wrestled and read and prayed and all these kinds of things, but it's not changing the wrong things about the world. We still live with tragedy. We still live with disease. We still live with children who pass away far too young. We still live with relationships that fall apart. None of that information changes it, is what he's saying. What is wrong cannot be made right. What has been lost, what is missing, cannot be recovered, no matter how wise we are, no matter how much information we have. And then he goes on to say, verse 16, I said to myself, look, I am wiser than any of the kings who ruled in Jerusalem before me. I have greater wisdom and knowledge than any of them. Look what he does next. After all this search for knowledge, he goes, verse 17, so I set out to learn everything from wisdom to insanity. That's what he's saying. He's like, well, if I couldn't learn anything from just good knowledge, I'm going to try bad knowledge. I'm going to try insanity. I'm going to try foolishness. But I learned firsthand that pursuing all of this is hevel. It's smoke. It's temporary. It's fleeting. So wisdom didn't work. Insanity didn't work. Foolishness didn't work. He tried every kind of form of knowledge that could possibly be to try to understand the way the world works, and it all turns out to be hevel, a chasing of the wind. Temporary, fleeting. And then he says in verse 18, the greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. Do you understand what he's saying? That the more he learned about the world, the more messed up the world became. Imagine for a moment if you and I could experience the depth of pain that the world carries all at once. 7 billion people on this planet. Imagine if you and I got to experience all of that pain at one time. It would be crushing. What the teacher is saying is that the more he's learned, whether wisdom or folly, whether madness or right-mindedness, it all becomes hevel. Because the more he learned, the more messed up the world is. The more you read about the brokenness in society, the more it feels meaningless, hevel, or smoke, temporary. So here's the question. What do we do? What do we do with the teacher's thesis statement that everything is meaningless? What do we do with the teacher's statement that everything is temporary, that everything is just the chasing of the wind? What do we do? Well, I'm going to fast forward through the 12 weeks of Ecclesiastes, and I'm going to give you the answer today, and it's going to be the answer you hear from me for the next 12 weeks. It is that we must live life backward. Eventually, we're not going to you don't see it all in chapter 1, but as the more we spend time in Ecclesiastes, the more you're going to see the teacher reminding us to live life backward, to reverse engineer life, to start with the end in mind so that the everyday life will make sense. This is the challenge of Ecclesiastes, for us to live our lives backwards. And where we find that in today's passage is in Ecclesiastes Chapter 1, verse 4, where it says, generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. What he's saying is we have to realize that the only certainty we have in life is our death. The only certainty we have in life is that one day our lives will end. That generations will come and generations will go. Douglas Wilson puts it this way: a wise believer is a person who knows the length of their tether. How long the cord is. Because we're all attached to God. God is allowing us to breathe. God is allowing our hearts to beat. God is allowing us to wake up in the morning and open our eyes. God is extending the length of our tether. And what is so important for us to realize, that wise followers of Jesus, we need to know the length of our tether, that we start with the end in mind. So I have 2 questions that I want to end with this morning. 2 questions that I hope will both stir you and challenge you in this coming week. The first one is, when was the last time you felt truly satisfied, and how long did that last? That's my first question. You don't have to answer it right now. Don't put your hands up because it's probably going to be awkward for everyone. But when was the last time you felt truly satisfied? If that's one of the burdens that is humankind, right, that we're never satisfied, when was the last time you thought to yourself, I'm good. I don't need any more time or money. I don't need any more experiences or relationships. When was the last time you felt truly satisfied, and how long did that last? Okay, and the second question, in what way are you trying to give meaning to your life, and is it working? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis that you are attempting to give your life meaning? And the question is it really working? Is it helping, right? Is that pursuit helping you to find genuine meaning? Because these are the 2 questions that I believe the teacher is asking us with today's passage, right? When was the last time we felt truly satisfied? How long did that last? And then, in what ways are you trying to give meaning to your life? And does it actually work for you? And if it does, I'd love to know. I mean it. I want to know. I want to learn through this process. But if humankind, if our biggest struggle is that we're never satisfied and we rarely find meaning in this world, it's time for us to ask the hard questions of ourselves. When was the last time we felt satisfied? And where do we look for meaning? So the challenge that is left before us, the challenge that the teacher gives us with Ecclesiastes Chapter 1 and for these next 12 weeks, is for us to live our life backward, to start with the end in mind, and that only by understanding the reality of our death can we experience the fullness of life that God has for us. So here's my challenge for you this week, okay? If this is something that's stirring in you, if you're starting to wrestle with this the way that I've been doing for the last 6 months, if you feel like the Holy Spirit's kind of moving in you, would you read the book of Ecclesiastes this week? It's 12 chapters. It'd probably take you less than an hour, would be my guess. But as you read, would you write down all the ways that people are trying to find either satisfaction or meaning, okay? So just all the different ways that the teacher observes that people look for satisfaction or meaning, right? Just write them down. Bullet points, you don't have to put paragraphs together. And then, would you do this for me? Would you pay attention to your soul? While you're writing those things down, pay attention to your own inner voice and ask yourself, which ones of these do I gravitate towards? Where do I look for satisfaction? Where do I look for meaning? And then here's the last question: where does God fit into my search for meaning and satisfaction? Where does God fit in to my search for purpose? The challenge for all of us is that we would live our lives backwards with the end in mind, knowing that our greatest burdens is that we're never satisfied and that we rarely find true meaning on this earth. Can I pray for us? God, thank you for this journey that we're about to start together in the book of Ecclesiastes. Thank you for the teacher that you inspired to write these words, the teacher that you inspired to wrestle with these words, the teacher that now, thousands of years later, you're using to teach us. We open our hands before you, gracious God. We open our hearts and minds before you and your word. And we pray that you would teach us to live our lives backward for your glory and for the sake of your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.